Anybody? We're on. Okay. So everybody, welcome tonight to the Evergreen Forum, and a big shout out and a huge thank you to EvergreenHealth, who makes these possible for us every single month with NAMI Eastside. And without their support, we wouldn't have these important conversations. I think this is one we definitely need to have. And then next month, please join us as we talk about the brain-gut connection as it works with mental health with our nutritionist, Liz Wozniak from Equilibrium Health. It's next month on the third Tuesday. And I'm Barbie Collins-Young. I'm the executive director of NAMI Eastside, and we have a lot of our NAMI Eastside staff here tonight because we're excited to hear about this topic. And it is something that a lot of people are starting to talk about because of the work of our speaker tonight. And just a little housekeeping, this is being recorded, so for those who are unable to attend, you can watch the recording. And if you would please mute your microphone, because there is always some background noise that not everybody wants to hear, dogs barking, things like that. If my dog barks, my microphone's on, I apologize. But the camera is yours, you can turn it off or on. And if you have a question, if you would please type that in the chat, or if you have a comment that you want to bring up tonight, if you just want to put it in the chat, and we'll try to weave them in through our conversations. And at the end, I'm hoping we have a little time to have more intimate conversations. But I'm super excited about this. Our guest presenter tonight, she's, when you meet people in your life, in a weird twist of fate, sometimes one becomes just a life-changing experience for you. Sometimes I cry, sorry, try not to, but that's our speaker tonight. We actually did a mental health forum years ago at Life Church in Kirkland, and had a connection where she came on our panel, and we were talking about mental health, and I was just completely blown away by the topic that she covered, which was adverse childhood experiences. Because I think a lot of times when you have adverse childhood experiences, we don't talk about those. And having somebody who is willing to talk about them and do it so vulnerably and refreshingly, and also share with us her book. I bought her book that day, and I have to say it was one of the most healing things that I did in my life, in my journey, was just simply read her book, and she'll share those with you. But this is a journey to healing, and we've had so many experiences with people who have why am I feeling this way? What is going on? And sometimes we try to address those just through the symptoms that we're feeling, when there's a root connection to actual adverse life experiences that you've been through, and sometimes you don't even know that you've been through them, and sometimes you do know, but maybe you've stuffed them inside or not know how to talk about it. So this actually will help get to the root of many of the problems that we're seeing and see where those feelings are coming from. Our speaker tonight is authentic, she's vulnerable, and she can share so much that might resonate deeply with many of you. And I told her I'd end with this, but I love you. So our topic tonight is, how do adverse childhood experiences affect us and our mental health? So Janyne McConnaughey, Ph.D., is a nationally known trauma-informed author and advocate, having lived through her own adverse childhood experiences, which is known as ACEs, until beginning therapy at the age of 61. She's now the author of 3 books describing the effects of childhood trauma and path to healing. She's a distinguished visiting professor at Tabor College and serves on the board of directors for the Attachment and Trauma Network. And as a speaker, she brings her 40-year experience as an educator and expertise in childhood development to NAMI Eastside's February Forum. So we're going to talk about those adverse childhood experiences, how ACEs affect mental health in adulthood, and paths to healing. Before I let her talk, I have so much to say about this. One of the things just in the work that we do at NAMI Eastside is we get a lot of people who are reaching out to us for assistance with some mental health issues. And just in the past few weeks, I've had many parents who are coming in for help with their adult children and some of the issues that they're going with. And some of the issues that they brought up, and as I reached back, I'm like, tell me about their childhood, et cetera. Like, some of them were adopted and had spent up to 18 months in an orphanage. And I was like, oh, hopefully some of those people are here tonight. I'm like, maybe you should listen to this, because those are the things that are unknown that can crop up later in life. And the forming of attachment is such an important thing, and being on the board of directors for the, if I can say it, the Attachment Trauma Network gives you a lot of in-depth knowledge about that. But looking at the source, we can actually work to repair that through different therapies instead of just trying to fix the symptoms. It can totally change the trajectory. So until now, we are just so happy to have Janyne McConnaughey here with us to talk about the game changer this could be for people. So tell us about kind of how you dove into this understanding of research, and you go.
Yeah, okay, it's time for me to go.
Time for you to
I'm always curious about how exactly I'm going to start once it appears, and so I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be here. About 4 years ago, I sat on my therapist's couch and I told her I don't have a future. I'd lost my career. We were living in our RV, which was not a bad thing. That was kind of cool. But I had completely fallen down the mental health rabbit hole, and realized that I had experienced extensive childhood trauma. And I say realize because I couldn't live knowing it, and I was very good at just not knowing what I didn't know, what I didn't want to know. So but I told her, I said, I don't have a future. I don't have a future. Everything is ended, and so here I am. And so I realized that the very best thing I could have ever done for myself was to choose healing. And it was a frightening choice at the time, because, and I was telling the group earlier that I didn't even tell anyone, or someone earlier today, that I didn't even tell anyone that I was in therapy my whole last year that I worked, and then I retired and devoted myself to healing. So along that journey of healing and beginning to understand myself, to understand the things that I had suffered with my entire life, did not understand, I thought I had a genetic predisposition, which, you know, is that part of it sometimes? Possibly, but mine was actually trauma, and a mother who also probably experienced trauma. And so one day I was actually doing a search. I've always had weight issues, gain weight, lost weight, gain weight, lost weight. And so as I was healing, I thought, well, I wonder if that has anything to do with my trauma. Well, it absolutely does. And so it was through that I discovered the ACEs research and began to realize that so much that I didn't understand about myself was a result of that. So I'm going to talk about the ACEs research. So I'm going to share my screen. And I pulled up the wrong one. I do. Okay, so we were talking about being human and not being ashamed, like not having a shame attack when you do something wrong. Well, there it was right there. I don't even know how that happened, because
You're totally fine. We're with you. You got it. This is it. Okay. You're on it.
What happened is it's hiding behind it. Oh, that is just so strange. Okay.
You got this one.
We got this one. So was the ACEs one up there before? My computer's
Yeah.
doing that thing again where it's pulling everything up in front of it. Okay. So
Yeah.
next
It's
time
just
say,
messing with you.
Janyne, you got it. You got it. It's there. All right. So the original ACE study was conducted with Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997, which is totally amazing that we understood what this research was telling us all those years ago, but only until about the last 10 years have we realized as a nation the impact that adverse childhood experiences have on us. So what they did, the researchers, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. I'm going to give some resources at the end that they're wonderful to read, and you can understand this more in depth. But what they did was they had the employees at Kaiser Permanente so they had their medical records, and then on the other hand, they created a 10-question survey that talked about experiences they had before the age of 18, and in the category of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so, and you can go online and ask the ACEs survey. I caution you though, because every time at the beginning, I used to actually have people take the ACEs, and people realized that they had experienced trauma, and sometimes it was very difficult in that setting. So I caution you, do self-care, but you may find out that this does affect you. So what they did was they compared the medical records with their answers on the ACEs. And what they found was that experiences such as what I have here on this slide, that they were at the root of the problems they were having medically, and their intent was medically as an adult. And then later they realized, oh, this applies to mental health too. So if they had experienced violence or abuse, witnessing violence in the home or community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide, and aspects of the child's environment could be substance abuse, mental health problems, and instability due to parental separation or household members. Now, I want to say right here that even though there were correlations between the issues that the people were experiencing as adults and their experience as children, it does not mean that, for instance, my ACE score is 5. And many of the things that I could have had a propensity to suffer from, I did not. And I'm going to explain why it's not a predictive tool. And so sometimes people get really discouraged. Oh, well, what's the use? I have an ACE score of 8. What's the use? 8, 9, 10. What's the use? No, that is not the purpose of this. So, but what they did find, and was that the increased number of ACEs that a person responded yes to and came up with their score, that it would also increase the chances that as an adult, they would struggle with adult alcoholism. Also with smoking as an adult. Another one was the ACE score, and you notice they just go in lockstep. As I go through these slides, every slide looks the same. So it doesn't matter whether it's smoking or alcoholism. The higher number of ACEs that a person experiences as a child, the higher the risk for these types of things. So impaired worker performance, absenteeism, serious financial problem, and serious job problems. And we always think of those as adult issues, right? When you're working with an employee and they're experiencing problems with this, and you immediately are like, well, you just need to get your act together, and we don't think about the fact that those problems are rooted in childhood experiences. Childhood experiences underlie chronic depression too, and you notice the same thing. Also, teen sexual behaviors intercourse before by 15, teen pregnancy, and teen paternity. And they're all the same charts. Childhood experiences underlie suicide attempts. And so in my story, as I began to unfold my story and unlayer it in therapy, I came to terms with the fact that at the age of 23, I tried to drive my car off a cliff. And that didn't make any sense to me. That did not fit into who I was, what I would decide to do. That didn't make any sense to me. And when I came across these charts and saw this, I went, that's why I ended up on that mountain road. It wasn't a terrible thing had happened to me that day, but I don't think that it would have caused me to try to end my life if it had not been for the underlying experiences that I had suffered as a child. And I haven't really talked a lot about what that actually was, but it's really interesting. When I first started doing that, that was like the first thing I did. I told my story, and now I'm like, oh yeah, I need to tell you my story. And that's healing, right? I mean, that's just a really cool part of healing. And I, if anyone has questions about that, I never hesitate to share. But I was sexually abused at a home daycare situation at the age of 3. I also had a mother who was not able to nurture me in the ways that I needed, and was very triggered by what had happened to me, and our relationship just deteriorated. And so trauma isn't just what happens to you, and there's many kinds of trauma, even, just that happens to be my story. But Peter Levine talks about trauma is what happens in the absence of an empathetic witness. And my dad did the best he could to help me, but no one understood trauma. So from 3 to 23, once a child is molested, they just become so vulnerable, and it just kept happening and happening. And that's what I tell maybe a part in my book. I don't even tell everything, and it's still overwhelming what happened to me. But that's why I ended out on the cliff, and it had to do with the ACEs. So, and here's some statistics about that. An ACE score of 7 or more increased the risk of suicide attempts 51-fold among children and adolescents, and 31-fold among adults. And so in the, well, let me just finish. Nearly 2/3, 64% of suicide attempts among adults were attributable to ACEs, and 80% of suicide attempts during childhood adolescence were attributable to ACEs. And so and that's actually how one of the topics when Barbie and I met, and I talked about this on the panel. And so what we're seeing is the result of ACEs. And so not completely, it isn't 100%. And so you can't look at a suicide attempt by a teenager and say, well, then something terrible must have happened to them as a child, because it just doesn't work like that. But it is a root cause that we need to consider. The interesting thing, and the last point I have on this, is that we emphasize physical abuse, but actually verbal abuse and emotional abuse is a stronger predictor than the physical abuse. And so I think that is an important thing to realize that. And a lot of times people will say, well, I wasn't abused as a child. No one ever hit me. I wasn't sexually abused. I wasn't, and they completely discount the fact that the emotional abuse as a child is equally, if not more, damaging to the adult, because it just embeds inside of you, and you come to think of yourself in those ways. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this one. And I don't know if we've had any questions or anything up to that point.
We actually haven't had any, and again, just to invite anybody with questions or comments in the chat. I think most people are just sitting here with their jaw dropped, like, oh, explains so much. It's almost like it's enlightening. So, can I ask you just another question before
Yes.
you
Well,
hit your next?
let me say,
Oh,
and that one thing I work with my next book that's coming out is a faith community faith book, and talking about the effects of ACEs in the faith community. And one reason that I was so astounded by those charts was the fact that we condemn those behaviors, we judge those behaviors, and probably that turn my life around to be compassionate toward others when I see them struggling, when I see them by the side of the road, when I see them homeless. I one of the books I'm going to suggest is What Happened to You. I don't think of them as well, what's wrong with you? You know, why don't you get your life together, right? Horrible thing to say, horrible. But understanding the ACEs gives us so much compassion for others. So, but yes, go ahead, Barb.
okay. Well, first, you do have a comment in the chat, which is just, this is all great information and very affirming of what my life has been. Thank you for your candor. So there's that. But go ahead.
I want to say to that, when I realized, I really had all the classic symptoms of PTSD, anxiety attacks, depression, just the whole litany of everything that I suffered with my whole life, and shame attacks, and like I would have, curled up fetal position because I couldn't get that slide up, got all messed. It's just so much inner turmoil. And when I realized that I could heal, oh my goodness, I was like, I'm just going to go talk to the world. I'm not going to hide. I'm just going to say what needs to be said. And so thank you. I appreciate when that's affirmed. So.
Yes. And we do have another question is, how do you advise schools to recognize and address ACEs in students? Because it appears like we should be doing that.
Well,
that's a big topic, I know, but
yeah, and actually, so I fly out on Friday. I don't know why I scheduled this week, but I fly to Houston on Friday, and the Attachment and Trauma Network, we are hosting the Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools Conference in Houston. So we have 2 days in person and 2 days and 2 days, well, 3 days in person and 2 days virtual that we're doing next week. And so as I'm now a president of the board, and I love this organization so much. And one of the main things that we do at the Attachment and Trauma Network is to help teachers and schools to understand what trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-responsive education looks like, and to change the paradigm about children's behaviors. And I'm also teaching a class at Tabor College in their Master's in Education in Neuroscience and Trauma. And that is the paradigm shift that we're working on. And so I want to say that there are people all over this nation that are trying to inform the schools and work. There's coalitions. There's it is phenomenal how much is going on, but we don't always see it. And it doesn't reach every school, and it doesn't reach every classroom. And our children it has been so difficult. I have 2 grandchildren that I've lived in the house with during this pandemic, and their mental health has suffered. It just has. And so even knowing all that I know, so I feel like, in fact, Secretary Cardona is speaking to our conference. Secretary of Education Cardona is going to speak to our conference. And these are some of the questions that we're asking him, and he's going to be responding to. So please know that we are working hard to turn the paradigm shift so that children that we look underneath their behaviors. We do not assume that the behavior just needs to be fixed, with that we know that there's something underlying that behavior. So thank you for that question.
yes. And before you dive into understanding what you teach in those graduate courses about the neuroscience and trauma. I know you have a lot of understanding you want to share with us, but we do have one more question that I'm hoping we can address, which is the definition of emotional and mental abuse. How does it mix in when one person has one child who's bipolar? How does that like mix in? How do you define that? What does that look like? And I think also keep in mind, like the pandemic, as parents, we try to protect our kids as much as possible, and sometimes trauma happens that we cannot prevent.
Right.
It's not always from a
thing that
parent.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One thing that I say in my book is that Winnicott talks about, a researcher in child development, talks about the good enough mother. And sometimes when we learn about ACEs and we learn about the effects of trauma, and we can start to look at ourselves and think we failed. And I lived with all that trauma as while I raised my children. And so one of the things that I do is speak to college students and say, please go, please seek healing. If you know you have trauma, seek healing before you have your own family, because your own children will trigger your trauma responses. So have I forgotten the question?
Yes, the definition of emotional and
Okay.
mental abuse, perhaps, what that might look like.
I think what I want to say about that is it's a very subjective thing. And in that anytime I went through a lot of EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing trauma. And that enabled me to see many situations in my childhood that because of my trauma, I interpreted incorrectly, but it was my real experience. So even though no one in the room could see that that would be a traumatic experience for me, I interpret it. I can give an example of that. When I was in about second grade, I kept getting stomach aches, and which is an indicator, right? So the doctor said, I think she just needs to stay home from school for a while, and I told my entire life that the teacher tied me to a chair and was tying children to the chair, and that she was taking children to the cloakroom and hurting them. And when I got to the memory in EMDR, I went, oh my goodness. She said, Janyne, if you don't stay in your chair, I'm going to have to tie you down. Okay. And so she was just joking with me. She did not mean anything by it. After I stayed home and was able to get myself stabilized as a child, however that happened, I went back, and she was a wonderful, nice teacher. I have always believed that I had a different teacher before and after I stayed home that week. I thought that they got rid of her and brought in a new teacher, and they didn't. I went and found my report cards, and the same teacher signed them all year long. And so it was my subjective experience to it. And so I think that the most important, and you cannot stop children from making weird connections. I mean, right? I mean, if you had any experience with the kids, you're just like, how did you connect? That's some of the stuff we laugh at, but sometimes it's tragic. But I think that our relationship with them and being relational and talking about things and seeing when they get emotional about something and seeing when they're dysregulating and showing them compassion and co-regulating with them and helping them to begin to talk about, so we can unwind some of those things. And so it's very subjective, and it depends on every child what they feel is emotionally abusive. Then sometimes it's just obvious, if your parent told you were worthless your whole life, that's trauma. There's just no question about that. And so sometimes it's less obvious. So I hope I answered that.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying is the key is that if you have a very sensitive child, the same thing could happen to another child and they could think nothing of it. And a sensitive child would think the world has just ended, and it will create that for them. So there's no like real definition when it comes to how a child experiences something. It's they do it on their own.
Right.
So it's a tough question, but I think you answered it well with subjective.
It is. And
Yeah.
so I'm the class I'm teaching right now, we're using Monadella hooks, and I do not have this on my resources. So I probably need to add that. But it's Monadella hooks beyond behaviors. And she addresses a lot of this. Is beautifully done. So that's a book I would suggest, especially for parents. She's coming out with, and she's on our advisory board for ATN, and she's coming out with a book next month that's specifically designed to parents. And so just her work is beautiful and based in polyvagal theory, which I'm going to kind of talk about in a minute.
Okay. Well, bring us to your next slide. We want to see your next slide.
Okay. Let's see how I do. Oh, you know what? Resources. Okay. Okay, this is what happens when you decide to do something a different way and you think you're going to be so clever and it doesn't work out well. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
All right, so we talked about the ACEs and childhood adversity and mental health are all about the ACEs. And as ACE study has shown, child abuse and neglect is the single most preventable cause of mental illness, the single most common cause of drug and alcohol abuse, and a significant contributor to leading causes of death, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and suicide. And Bessel van der Kolk in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, this is from that book. And I've been on the panel for a book study on this book the past few weeks. And it's through his Trauma Research Foundation. And it's been a fascinating discussion and so forth. And this is a lot of what we talk about. So Bessel van der Kolk tried in the last diagnostic manual to include developmental trauma, and it was turned down. And so developmental trauma is not a diagnosis that is accepted at this point. That's frustrating because what I experienced was developmental trauma, and without understanding it as developmental trauma, I instead was diagnosed with anxiety, depression, a whole litany of things that did not include everything that was involved. So also developmental trauma includes that the attachment relationship with a child. Now, I could talk all night long about attachment and about the co-regulation and about how the mother's gaze enables the child to co-regulate, and about the amygdala and the receptors, neuroreceptors, and the mirroring. I could talk about that all night long. And so, but I think that the important point is that when children experience adverse experiences as small children, it actually changes the structures of the brain. I put this little girl in every slideshow that I do, because this was me going to therapy and just, can you fix this? Like, there's something horribly wrong with me and I don't know how to fix it. Can you fix it? And my therapist laughed. She said, I don't have a magic wand, but we'll get there. And she was right, but there is no magic wand. And it is very much relational trauma requires relationships to heal. And that is just absolutely necessary. So, so here's our brain. It's forming, it's in the process of forming, and trauma occurs. And when this happens, there's a lack of growth in the prefrontal cortex. This has to do with thinking, executive functions, impulse control, all of those kinds of things that show up in the classroom as learning issues. Okay. There's a reduction in the hippocampus volume that affects memory, past, present, narratives, etc. And there's hyperactivity in the enlarged amygdala, and that's where you get the anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks, trauma loops. I call them trauma loops. I would just go round and round and round and often repeat the same mistakes again and again. So traumatized people so often keep repeating the same problem and have such trouble learning from experience. If you have children who have experienced trauma, often it's very hard for them to learn, and they just keep doing the same things again and again. We now know that their behaviors are not the result of moral failings or signs of lack of willpower or bad character. They're caused by actual changes in the brain. And the wonderful thing about the brain is the brain can heal. But if you look at brain scans of children who have experienced trauma at a young age, and the brain scans of children who had nurturing environments, the scans look very different from each other. And so we have to realize that. And especially, I don't even talk about fetal alcohol syndrome, but that is damage that's done to the brain that is very often overlooked. And so but we just want to talk about behavior, right? We just want to change. So I have a therapist now, and I get my appointments, and it's for behavioral therapy. and I mean, okay, that's where we are. That's what we call it. And we help people, and eventually their behaviors change, but we have to understand the underlying reasons that the behaviors exist. All right. So then the troubling long-term effects, and one of the things that I do in college, I was a child development major, and I have been on the rooftop screaming about supporting young families my entire life, because of this. For children who were physically abused, the chance of being diagnosed with a conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder went up by a factor of 3. Neglect or sexual abuse doubled the chance of developing an anxiety disorder. Parental psychological unavailability or sexual abuse doubled the chance of later developing PTSD, and the chance of receiving multiple diagnoses was 54% for children who suffered neglect, and 60% for physical abuse, and 73% for sexual abuse. And so the troubling long-term effects, Desmond Tutu, who we lost from our world recently, he said we need to go upstream and figure out why people are falling in the river. And so that's what ACEs does. It goes upstream and helps us understand that people just don't one day fall in the river. There's something that's happening upriver, and that a lot of times that's support of young families. All right, so then we talk about resilience, and sometimes I kind of hang out in the trauma survivor world, and sometimes we get really irritated by being told, how resilient we are. And a lot of my resilience was actually survival. And it wasn't very healthy, but like my overachieving and academic and having to be super successful. And I talk about that in my next book. But resilience depends. Real resilience is based in relationships. So teaching a child resilience, we're going to teach you how to be resilient. No, the only way it'll ever happen is if you have a relationship. And this is from the Harvard site I have on my resource list. Resilience depends on supportive, responsive relationships and mastering a set of capabilities that can help us respond and adapt to adversity in healthy ways. And it's those capacities and relationships that can turn toxic stress into tolerable stress. And the attachment relationship is a buffer for actually adversity. And so when you do not have the attachment relationship and then trauma happens too, it's a really, really difficult combo. So, but all is not lost, and there is such a thing as positive childhood experiences. In fact, the ACEs consortium, ACEs community just changed their name about a year ago to PACES, because they wanted to emphasize that it isn't just And I have no idea what fell in my house, but it was really loud. If anybody heard that, I'm
Didn't
like,
hear
what
it.
happened over there? So positive childhood experiences. Did you feel able to talk to your family about feelings? So many people answered no to that. No, we never talked about feelings in our family. Do you feel your family stood by you during difficult times, enjoy participating in community traditions, feel a sense of belonging in high school, feel supported by friends, and have at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in you, and feel safe and protected by adults in your home? So all of those are ways that we build a buffer around children. And that's why I was a teacher educator, because I knew that my teachers, I just want to cry for the teachers right now. I get really emotional about it because I live in a family of educators and it is so difficult right now. And anything you can do to support a teacher, that will pass down to helping the children in their classrooms. So there are ways. When we talk about ACEs, we also need to talk about, okay, we know that this is a problem, but what can we do about that? And that is by understanding the neurobiology of the child and how to help these children regulate. I think that a child from a very nurturing home learns to self-regulate. And I realized that I was 61 and I had learned ways to control my behavior, but I had never learned how to soothe my sympathetic nervous system. And so I was just constantly flooded with all of these stress chemicals in my body, and everything triggered me, and I was controlling it. And it looked great. It looked like I was very successful. And in fact, it's funny because people say, well, you don't seem very much different. And I said, well, you can't see inside me. You have no idea how different I am inside from what I was when I looked so successful. So, okay, so I'm going to stop sharing right there. And
I don't think we have any more questions in the chat yet, but do have a question for you again, because, our work at NAMI Eastside, I'm just wondering how this work really intersects with the type of work that we do with our support and our education and trying to help people through this.
I think that, of course, it intersects. I mean, that's
Intersects, yeah.
we got connected. We were like, oh, we're all on the same page. And I think that the paradigm shift that we are trying to make in the trauma-informed world with NAMI is to not ask what's wrong with you, but to ask what happened to you. And one of the books that I list on the resources in a second addresses that directly. And I think we have to understand that every behavior served a purpose. Okay. So, for instance, from a teacher perspective, I'd hear teachers say, oh, this child is so manipulative. And so I talk about this whenever I speak to teachers. I said, they'll say they're so needy. They're not needy. They have unmet needs. They have needs that have never been met. And they're not manipulative. They've just figured out how to get those needs met, because the adults in their life weren't able for whatever reason. And I think there's so many adults are doing the best they can, but it's generational. They did not experience nurturing, and they're trying to raise their children, and they don't have any other patterns. So I realized that I was really manipulative. I was really clever at it, but I could make things happen. I could make people do what I needed them to do, right? And that's what manipulation is, but it's because I had to. because I had a mother who didn't meet my needs, and I had to figure out how to make her do what I needed her to do to take care of me. And so, so I think that all of us are ultimately, we do want to change behaviors, right? We want people to live thriving, productive, healthy lives. And a lot of that involves the choices they make. And so I think that the thing that makes it difficult is that some say it's anywhere from 85 to 95% of what we do is unconscious, that only a very small fraction of the decisions we make are conscious, and everything else is this, and we're just trying to be safe. We just are trying to be safe. And so whether it's alcohol or whether it's drugs, or a lot of that is trying to soothe that inner turmoil. And if I remember thinking about self-care. When my therapist told me to do self-care, I'd be like, I do self-care. I've taken care of myself really well. Maybe not in healthy ways, but I have taken care of myself really well. And so, so I think that we have to understand that you have to look at behavior through a completely different mindset than what we tend to do. So I don't know, that intersection of
Well,
trying
it does help so much. I just think this understanding for people alone and just starting to explore down into the, root cause of things answers so much, that there is research that they can look at. There's resources, there's books. Before we get to all the resources, we do have one question about self-soothing, because you've talked about that just a little bit. Like, can you talk about how to self-soothe and how we can understand what that means? Like, what is that?
So this is really kind of interesting, because I during therapy, I get my phone out and I play games, Candy Crush, lots and lots of Candy Crush. And it was a coping mechanism, and it wasn't a bad one necessarily, but it wasn't soothing me, it was distracting me. And so I think a distinction has to be made between the things that we do that actually internally calm us, versus the things that distract us and help us to feel less distressed, because we're not recognizing the distress inside of us. I don't know if that. And so when I talk about self-soothing, it's something that a small child learns in co-regulation with the caring adult. And so actually the mother, and I'm really worried because these things are so distracting that we're not spending the time with the eye contact with small children that we need to be, because we need to be looking in that child's eyes, because that's how they learn to soothe themselves, is through the mirroring of the mother. Of course, that means the mother needs to be soothed, and it all has to do with our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic. Our sympathetic is danger, and our parasympathetic will calm us. And to learn the difference between that and recognize those different sensations in our body, and to realize when Mona Delahook says when we're in the red, or when we're in the blue, shut down or angry, and when we're on the green path where we're just calm inside. And I remember the day in therapy when I went, so I don't, and my therapist was like, what's wrong? And is there something wrong? Talk to me about this. And I said, my brain is quiet. It was such a phenomenal experience that my brain was not just going in every direction. It was calm. And that was when I realized that I had never felt that in my life. And so soothing is to get your your inner self in a state of calmness. And so I hope that answers it, because a lot of times we go to distractions like binge watch. I mean, those things aren't necessarily bad. I still
We're
play
good
games.
at distraction, aren't we? But that's a really good warning too.
That it's not necessarily soothing yourself and calming your sympathetic nervous system.
Ah, I think that was a good explanation. I hope it answered that question. We could talk about this for a whole nother episode, but I know you have another side with all of your resources, because we want to know how we're supposed to start this healing process and where do we begin. There's a lot out there.
Whoops, I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
Go ahead. No, it's all you.
Well,
it
closed again, so I've got to.
Okay, just so you know, I put her books here in the chat. The first one that I had the pleasure of reading was Brave, a personal story of childhood healing, which helped me so much. And She Won't Toot Her Own Horn, really good.
There's 3 books.
Okay, that's so helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me tell you, the first one was my journey through therapy and unlayering and I actually had exquisite dissociative coping mechanisms, and but not very healthy ones. Then they gave up at the age of 61. But so that it talks about dissociative identity disorder. It talks about the healing process, the EMDR, the journey my therapist and I went on as I healed. And then the second one talks about behavior, and it's the one that I really wrote when ATN helped me to understand, Attachment Trauma Network helped me to understand the underlying what's underneath the behavior. So they're kind of companion books, but the second one talks about ways to heal as an adult or as a child, and the behaviors, the core reasons for behaviors. And then the third one is my faith journey as an adult. So it's how I survived as an adult with dissociative coping mechanisms, and somehow came out with a very strong faith, and with a lot of understanding of how we in faith communities can do a better job of helping those people who have experienced trauma. So those were my books, and then I'll go back to the slide for the resources. And my website actually has more, but I wanted to just put the main ones here. You know, sometimes I go to, and there's like this list that's 20, and I'm like, how would I have on my website, which is Janyne.org. I have a page that says, how do you become trauma informed? And it actually has 5 steps you can take, and it has a video to watch, and takes you through that. But these are the websites that are my go-tos. If I want information about ACEs, these are the websites that I go to. And the books, Nadine Burke Harris, until very recently, she was the Surgeon General in California. And her book, if you want to understand the effects of ACEs in community and in families, that her book is the one. And then Bessel van der Kolk's book is like the Bible of trauma. I mean, it's just it changed the world is what it did. And it's still on the bestseller list. It's really remarkable. And then the latest one by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry, What Happened to You? And I want to say that I don't generally like audiobooks. I'd rather read, but their audiobook of this, they actually talk to each other, is fabulous. And then at the Attachment and Trauma Network, we have a lot of resources. The Attachment and Trauma Network began working with parents who had adopted children, and we have support groups and parenting resources and so forth for children who have developmental trauma as a result of their lack of attachment and traumatic experiences before adopted. And adoption, just even a good adoption, is still a loss. So you just have to recognize that it has its effects. So, and then I want to say, if you want a great resource for what are the best trauma books, excuse me, the ATN has a bookshop, and my books are available there, and you can order any of these books there, and we get a small kickback on it. So I always like to advertise that that's a source for any of the trauma-informed books, and they're vetted. So it's like ATN chose to put these in our bookstore, so you can trust that that they've been vetted, and they're the main ones. Okay.
Can I add one book that has not been vetted, but I'm just really proud of my sister because she just got published, one of her stories, and this feisty, dangerously amazing women using their voices and making an impact in their short stories, and a lot of them are about trauma and recovery. So
what is the title of it?
Whoop, you can't see it because I got my blurry thing on, but it's called Feisty. There it is, Feisty.
Oh.
That's my sister.
That's it. That is so okay. I'm writing it down. Wonderful, wonderful.
Very proud of her. So I know we're running out of time. I don't know if anybody has any questions they want to end with today, but feel free to ask away and comments while we have our captive audience of Dr. McConnaughey. But let me just say thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts, and hopefully many of you who are watching just have kind of opened your eyes to the possibility that there's healing available, and that some of the symptoms that we keep addressing might have a deeper source. Even if we can't quite understand what they are, it starts a exploration of healing, which is so beautifully important. So thank you for using your voice. You are a feisty woman, that I do know for sure. And I'm so glad that you took this journey, because you've been changing lives and worlds just as you come along. So thanks for continuing to, dedicate yourself to also NAMI Eastside. Appreciate it. Questions, comments, anybody? You guys can unmute now. We have a few minutes before we end. I'm happy to stop the recording if you guys want to say things that you don't want recorded. So I will hopefully, whoops, is Mark still here?